Of course, you've probably heard of something called reincarnation. But what exactly is reincarnation? Reincarnation is the idea that when a person dies, their soul comes back to life, but in a different body. Meaning, after someone dies, their soul leaves the body and enters someone else's. And that soul supposedly carries traces from the previous life. Memories, emotions, feelings. Not clearly, though, more like in a hazy, vague way. And the person might start remembering those things gradually, especially if the environment around them helps trigger those memories. That's the basic idea behind reincarnation. Now, I'm not saying this is true or real. Personally, I don't believe in it. And no one with a thinking brain would just blindly accept it. But what's strange are the stories. The actual events that happened, events that are real and documented. And that's exactly what we're diving into today. So, without dragging it out, let's jump right in. Welcome to Tag. Our story today is about a woman named Dorothy Eady, later known as Omm Sety, which means Mother of Seti. She claimed she knew Pharaoh Seti I. Her story is strange and full of events that seem totally irrational. Even though we don't believe in reincarnation, people used to say Dorothy was the reincarnation of an ancient Egyptian priestess. And that belief led her to leave everything behind and move to Egypt. She later helped uncover major archaeological discoveries. And she had knowledge of things no one was supposed to know, especially considering she was born in England and lived there for the first 27 years of her life. So how did she know ancient secrets? How did she help discover sites and artifacts historians didn't even know about? That's the big question we're trying to answer today. Dorothy, aka Omm Sety, was born in London in 1904, and she was an only child. She got all the love and attention from her parents. But when she was just 3 years old, something happened that completely changed her life. She fell down the stairs at home and hit her head really hard. So hard that when the doctor came, he told her parents she was dead. It was a massive shock. But after a little while, they suddenly saw her get up like nothing had happened. She started playing and talking as if she hadn't just died a few minutes earlier. The doctor was in shock. He was absolutely sure there were no signs of life in her body when he checked. He had no explanation for what had just happened. Now sure, maybe the doctor made a mistake like her father thought. Maybe it was just a miracle, God's will, and she still had time left to live. But the real weirdness came after. Her parents started noticing that she was talking in a strange accent. She was just a 3-year-old girl, barely even learning to speak. So where did that accent come from? Later on, doctors diagnosed her with something called foreign accent syndrome, a rare condition that can happen when someone suffers a strong blow to the head or falls into a coma. When they wake up, they start speaking in a completely different accent, one they've never used before. Dorothy started telling her parents about dreams she kept having, recurring dreams about a beautiful place. She described a huge building with massive columns, something like a palace or a temple. She also spoke of a garden next to it. This place had completely captivated her. At the time, Dorothy was still a child, so she didn't understand what exactly this place was. But to her, it was more beautiful than anything in the real world. She was so attached to this dream place that her mother would often find her crying in bed after waking up, crying because she wanted to go there. She wanted to live there. She needed to see it. She kept saying, "That's my home." She even refused to accept that the house she was living in was her real home. The place in the dream had become her reality. Her parents tried so many times to convince her that it was just a dream and that their actual home was the one she lived in now. But Dorothy refused. She insisted that her real home was the building she kept seeing in her dreams. This continued for a while until one day, her parents decided to take her to the British Museum. There was an entire section dedicated to ancient Egyptian civilization. the time of the pharaohs. And the moment Dorothy walked into that section, she was completely stunned. She started screaming, "This is my home!" while pointing at the models and statues of ancient Egyptian temples. She was convinced that they looked exactly like the building from her dreams. She stood there, mesmerized, like she was enchanted. After a moment, she began kissing the feet of the statues, saying, "These are my people, my loved ones." Her face lit up with a kind of wonder and joy that can't even be described, like someone who had finally returned home after being lost for years. Of course, it was a bit awkward for her parents. She was running through the museum's halls, crying and shouting strange things, drawing attention from everyone there. But eventually, they managed to calm her down and take her home. But from that moment, everything changed. Dorothy now linked the beautiful place from her dreams, the temple and the garden, to ancient Egypt. She became obsessed with Egyptian civilization. She started reading everything she could find about it, and constantly asked her parents to take her to any museum or exhibition in London or around England that had Egyptian artifacts. This obsession even caused her problems at school. She was enrolled in a Catholic Christian school, and her family were devout Catholics. But Dorothy started comparing Catholicism to the ancient Egyptian religions, which got her in serious trouble, so much so that she was expelled from school. Dorothy already knew how to read and write in English quite well, but now her interest shifted to hieroglyphics, the ancient symbols and script used by the pharaohs. She used to say she knew this language but had forgotten how to read it. One day, she came across a photograph of the Temple of Pharaoh Seti I. When she saw it, she immediately said, "That's my home." It was a grand building with columns, just like the one she described in her dreams. She was convinced this was the place from her dreams and that it had once belonged to her. But at the same time, she was confused. She started asking, "Where's the garden?" The one she always saw in her dreams. She didn't realize that thousands of years had passed, and any garden that may have existed would have vanished over time. Later, she saw a photograph of the mummy of Seti I, the pharaoh who had built that temple, and she claimed she knew him personally. Yes, she said she personally knew a pharaoh who had died thousands of years ago. Dorothy continued to study Egyptian civilization with passion. She eventually learned how to read and write hieroglyphics fluently. And at a very young age, she became an expert in the language, culture, and religion of ancient Egypt. But the dreams didn't stop. She kept having the same dream about the temple and the garden. And there was another recurring dream. This one was more of a nightmare. In that nightmare, she saw herself in a dark place, standing before a temple priest, a man who looked like the high priest. She said he questioned her violently. He interrogated her, but she refused to answer. So, he beat her. That nightmare kept repeating too, and we'll understand its meaning a bit later on. Anyway, when she turned 27, due to her studies and knowledge of ancient Egyptian civilization, she met an Egyptian man named Imam Abdel Meguid, who was an English teacher at the time. He fell in love with her and asked her to marry him, and she agreed immediately without hesitation. It's not clear whether she agreed because she loved him too, or out of love for the fact that he was Egyptian, and would take her to Egypt, a place she considered her real home, even though she had never been to that country before. Anyway, they got married and arrived in Egypt. As soon as she arrived, she knelt down and kissed the ground, saying she had finally reached her home. After a while, she gave birth to a boy, and Dorothy insisted on naming the boy Seti, after her attachment to Pharaoh Seti I. From then on, everyone around her called her Sety. The story didn't stop at just dreams. Later, Sety said that she began to receive visits from the spirit of an ancient Egyptian woman named Hor-Ra, which she claimed was the spirit of Pharaoh Seti I. She said this spirit began to tell her about its past life. She felt that this spirit was actually with her in reality. When Hor-Ra appeared to her in a dream, she would wake up in a state between consciousness and unconsciousness, almost like someone walking in their sleep. Seti would write everything this spirit said to her on paper and in hieroglyphics. She acted as though she was possessed, meaning when her husband would wake up and try to speak to her while she was writing, she wouldn't respond, as if she were in another world entirely. Strangely, she wrote about 70 pages in hieroglyphics, describing the story that Hor-Ra had told her. In brief, the story written in the 70 pages said that Seti's spirit was actually the spirit of an ancient Egyptian priestess named Bint Rashid. This priestess, named Bint Rashid, was abandoned by her parents at the temple door when she was born, and the temple priests raised her. When she turned 12, the high priest of the temple gave her a choice. She could leave the temple and live freely, or remain a priestess in the temple, but on the condition that she would remain a virgin for the rest of her life. Of course, at 12, a young girl, what would she do? It was almost impossible for her to live alone, so she decided to remain a priestess in the temple, taking an oath to remain a virgin for the rest of her life. The problem came when she later met Pharaoh Seti I, and they fell in love. This love led them to have an affair, and soon after, the priestess found herself pregnant. When they discovered she was pregnant, she was imprisoned and interrogated. The high priest, who had made her vow to remain a virgin, kept asking her who the father was and how it had happened. But Bint Rashid refused to speak, not wanting to expose Pharaoh Seti I. The high priest continued to interrogate, beat, and torture her for a long time. This was the same scene that Seti experienced in her nightmares, a recurring nightmare. The end of Bint Rashid's story was suicide. Unable to bear the situation, she decided to end her life. This is the story that Hor-Ra told Seti, and she wrote it over the course of a year as the spirit would visit her in her dreams and speak to her while she wrote in hieroglyphics. She wrote it all down in 70 pages, with all the details. During this period, Imam Abdelmegwid, her husband, began to grow anxious and fearful of her, especially when she would have these dreams and sit to write. He decided to divorce her. After Seti divorced her husband, her son Seti stayed with her, and they moved to the Giza Governorate, to a place called Nazlet el Saman, which is near the pyramids. During this time, she met the famous Egyptian archaeologist Dr. Salim Hassan, one of the most renowned archaeologists in Egypt's history. Dr. Salim Hassan was impressed by her knowledge of Egyptology, the study of ancient Egyptian civilization and archaeology. In his admiration for her, he decided to hire her as an assistant, making her the first woman employed in the Egyptian Antiquities Department. From that moment, she became well acquainted with many Egyptian archaeologists and built significant relationships with them. After Dr. Salim Hassan passed away, Seti worked with another famous archaeologist, Ahmed Fakhri. He offered her two positions. One was in the Archaeological Records Office in Cairo, which had a good salary, and the other was as an archaeological illustrator at Abydos, in the Temple of Pharaoh Seti I, the very place she had always considered her home and the one she had always dreamed of. However, the salary for the latter position was lower. Without hesitation, Seti chose the second position, despite the lower salary, because she wanted to return to the place she considered her home and to live there at any cost. As soon as Seti entered the temple, she said, "Yes, I lived here. There's no doubt about it." And she kept talking about her knowledge of the place and its secrets. The head of the Antiquities Department in the temple, or the chief inspector in the department, decided to test her. Of course, they knew about her claims and her strange story, which was well known among specialists and archaeologists. So, the head of the Antiquities Department decided to conduct an experiment to see if she really knew the place as she claimed. They took her to a dark room and stood her in front of some wall paintings, asking her to identify them without seeing them. She was supposed to recognize them based on their location, since she claimed to have been a priestess in that temple, so she should be able to recognize the paintings by their position. And indeed, Seti managed to identify all of the paintings, even though they were in complete darkness and no one could see anything. They suggested that maybe she had seen the paintings in pictures before, or perhaps she had entered the temple at some point in the past. But according to their records, this was her first visit to the temple, and these paintings had never been published or their locations disclosed before. How did she know? No one knew. Seti continued to work at the temple with the antiquities department in the years that followed, contributing to significant discoveries in the area. One of her most important achievements was that she identified the location of the garden, a garden she had always seen in her dreams, a garden that had disappeared after thousands of years. She took them to a specific area near the temple and told them that the garden had been there or had been located there, and that her first meeting with Pharaoh Seti had occurred in that garden. After they excavated the area she pointed to, they indeed found the remains of the garden buried under that spot, with the exact description she had given. The arrangement of the stones and the details were just as she described them, things she shouldn't have known, things buried beneath the ground that no one, not even she, was supposed to know about. Another discovery she contributed to was the identification of tunnels beneath the northern side of the temple. They had never excavated that area before, so Seti told them, "Dig here, and you'll find tunnels underneath." And indeed, they found tunnels or channels just as she had described. How did she know all this? No one could understand. Another significant discovery she helped with was a tomb in one of the temple's areas, an area they called the Valley of the Kings. They dug where Seti had pointed, and indeed, they found a tomb just as she had described. The situation was puzzling on all levels. Archaeologists couldn't comprehend how she was doing these things, and they weren't ready to accept her claim that she was the spirit of the ancient Egyptian priestess who had lived in the temple thousands of years ago. But at the same time, they had no explanation for the discoveries she had pointed to and led them to uncover. There are many details about her work during this period that are documented, but we won't delve deeper into them because there are too many. The main point is that Seti was a puzzling phenomenon, as attested by many well-known Egyptian archaeologists. Seti had always wished to be buried in that temple after she died, and even made a small tomb for herself, requesting to be buried there. But after her death in 1981, the Egyptian authorities rejected her request, and she was buried in a regular cemetery. The exact logical explanation for Seti's story and the events that occurred with her remains unclear. Was it a trick or luck? Could she have had exceptional intelligence in these matters and a strong vision? Or was it a series of carefully executed deceptions? All possibilities exist, but the possibility of believing her story, that she was the spirit of the ancient priestess, is rejected by any sane person. What do you think about the matter? Write your thoughts in the comments below. And that's it for today's video. Here are some more videos you'll definitely enjoy. I recommend you watch them. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you'll get the latest videos as soon as they're uploaded. See you in the next video, and goodbye.